And we are live here with Dude, What's the Bid? Episode 24. 24. That's a nice multiple, right? 24. That's like 6 months.
Something like that. It's hard to believe.
Casey? It really is. It is. My name's Kevin Hill, here with Casey Larkin, as always, talking about the freight world. And I think Casey is live from Technovations out in not Jacksonville, but close to Jacksonville. Where's the actual location?
I misread the calendar, and the event ended a couple hours ago.
It was did it?
Beach. Well, yeah, it's hosted at the Marriott there at TPC Sawgrass. Gorgeous venue. Yeah, it's a great event. They had a Shark Tank today with 4 cool companies up there. They had Q'd, they had Drum Kit, they had Happy Robot, and then they had Front. It does email stuff, but yeah, really cool panel as well of sharks. Kevin Nolan is now, spending most of his time with Soap Creek and his family office. And they also had Andrew Silver up there who, knows what it takes to grow a brokerage and sell it as well. And then the third guy, I cannot remember his name specifically, but he's the banker and I think a founder as well behind Freightvana. So really cool channel. And Drum Kit.
I haven't heard of them.
Dog. Yeah, we actually, I don't know if you were there that day or not, but and I think it was actually called Axle at the time. Axle API rebranded to Drum Kit, so it's Drew. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense then. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not the first company to have to rebrand after starting with that one.
Yeah.
But no, it was interesting. The Axle folks were there. The Axle Logistics folks there, growing like a weed. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
They're maybe the fastest growing private brokerage I've ever heard of. I was hearing some numbers being thrown around what they might do this year, and really very impressive. So
yeah,
great.
They are fast. They're very fast. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing up the street, and well, not up the street anymore for us, but in Knoxville.
Right. I know they've got a big presence in Chattanooga too. But yeah, it was interesting. Kevin Nolan was up there, and his introduction, he mentioned, the great brokerages aren't necessarily great companies, but they use tech very well.
Yeah.
So that was kind of setting the stage for these tech companies that, ideally are supposed to be partners to help these brokers grow, right? Another thing they mentioned is like margins probably are never going to be what they were in 21, 22.
Nope.
So, how do we move forward as an industry? Seems like there's a lot of cool tech in the space. So,
yep, there is. So there is more growing every day. And so it's a good conference. So that's good to hear. Good to hear. But yeah, we have an OG joining us today.
For real.
The OG podcaster. He's backstage right now, bumping his fist. Mr. Joe Lynch from the Logistics of Logistics. He started this whole craze really back in some years ago. I don't even know what year, 2017, 2018, something like that. It was one of the first logistics podcasts, and does a lot of great work for companies, helping them enhance their marketing and their brand strategy. And he's just all around great guy. So let's bring him up right now.
Hey, thank you so much. I don't know about old G, but I'm old.
Not necessarily. Yeah, the original gangster.
Gangster, I'm not so sure. Gangsters don't have gray hair, wrinkles.
When did you start your podcast?
About 6.5 years ago, and you were the second guest. I just told Casey that before we went live.
Yeah.
And I told them that was when my podcast was something that friends did for their pathetic loser podcast friend. But yeah, that was we're the blind leading the blind way back then. So yeah, it's been 6.5 years. We've done probably 600, a little more than that. So
Yeah.
it's been
And-
great. I've really
and
enjoyed it. You know, Kev, I know I've had this conversation with you before that I would do the podcast for free even if no one listened, because of who I get to talk to.
Same here. I enjoy it. It brings a lot of benefits. Untold benefits, tangible, intangible. It's really even in today's world, right, where everyone's a podcaster. It seems like.
I think it's especially in today's world where you get to know somebody beyond the LinkedIn profile, beyond the articles that they say they wrote, but maybe they didn't, and nobody particularly cares. I wrote a lot before I started the podcast, and when you're writing, you're always hoping that a little bit of my personality comes through, that, they see that subtle little witticism you put in there. And then after a while, you realize you're just browsing over articles and you don't catch anything. And on podcasts, my goal is always the same, as I want my audience to be able to, my guests to be able to tell their story, share their personality. We do prep, but I also want it to sound like a conversation as opposed to an infomercial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that certainly Dooner and I always talked about, and I think we've talked about it too, because it's people remember how you made them feel.
Yep.
Months later, years later, than what you actually said.
Yep.
And that's where it comes. If you want to do an infomercial and get all your company information out there, get your sales pitch out there, if that's what you're leading with, everyone.
Yep.
Let's put it this way: no one will remember what you said.
Right.
10 minutes later, almost, right? But certainly 10 days later, no one's. But how you made them feel, right? The emotions that they take out of it, and maybe one little soundbite.
Yes.
And that's the wonderful world of podcasting.
Yeah.
Right. Long form content podcast. I think to your point, Joe, really lends itself to being able to spend that time, make that connection with somebody. I think you're right.
Well, yeah.
Helicopter just passing, but the long form content, great way to make a connection. And there's a tweet that went viral this week, right? Kind of boiling marketing down to a static image. On the left, it was an iPod with, it said 5 gigabytes of storage, and on the right, it's an iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Right.
That is an ad that, is evocative, right? Gives you some emotion. This thing's going to change my life. It's a lot easier, I think, to your point, Joe, to do that face to face and having a conversation as opposed to in written content.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, you can get to know, like, and trust somebody on a podcast. Mm-hmm. If I get to know, like, and trust the guest who's on the podcast, and my audience gets to know, like, and trust them, and then they go, oh, by the way, and Casey's also an expert in the problem that I have. That's the best you can do. And it's really hard to say, oh, I read this article, I really like this author. You don't even know if the author wrote it. And even if they did, it's not the same. There's no emotional attachment. And by the way, one of my daughters told me this. I listen to Audible books. And she said, we've been listening to stories for a lot longer than we've been using written language. Mm-hmm. So stories have always resonated better. And one last point here. I heard somebody say this the other day. He says, every point should have a story, and every story should have a point. And
exactly right.
That works.
Yeah, it goes back to nonverbal communication, right? And that to take whatever percentage you want today, 95% of all communication is through tone of voice, facial expressions, body language. Words are at the end of that. The least important out of those four items.
Yep.
So it's all the feeling that you take away from that podcasting, and that's why long form content really shines.
Yep.
Does. And I've listened to a number of your podcasts, Joe, with some really interesting folks.
Thank you.
I think over 600 episodes, right? And I know I listened to one where you were interviewing my dad, coincidentally, like a year ago, talking about the venture capital space.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I didn't know John Larkin was your dad. He's a legend.
Funny enough, yeah. I heard a lot about trucks and trains.
I interviewed your dad at least twice, and yeah, people really respond well to that.
It was interesting because, it seemed like the sentiment from VC shifted, right? There's some like wealth that came into the market from this, wave of technology that, came first, right? You've got V53 now with guys like Pat Martin and Dan Powell, smart logistics money as opposed to just, maybe VC money from San Francisco from other tech industries being thrown in.
Right.
Seems like, as well, it's not just grow at all costs as much anymore and increase headcount, but, being a little bit more selective in the problems and the people that folks are investing in. So that was like a year ago. I'd love to hear, like, who are some of the folks that you've had a conversation with over the last year that have enlightened you with some problems? Or where do you think things are going, man? It's like a super exciting time, I think, to be in the industry, and people are starting to figure out maybe where tech fits, and I don't know. So,
well, I will say,
that's all right.
Interviewing people like your dad, and again, I'm not just saying this to be nice. There is no one like your dad because of what he's accomplished. He took a lot of the, as you well know, or anyone listening, John Larkin took a lot of the top logistics companies, transportation companies, public a long time ago, probably before most listeners were born, and he's still at it. And I don't know if you call him private equity or venture capital, but I suspect you could call them both. And he's had his hands in a whole bunch of the success stories in this industry. And I know he is still advising companies that are going to be tomorrow's leaders. And so I love talking to private equity guys and venture capital. Again, I think your dad could qualify as both. And because they are looking at the world very differently than all of us. I always say sometimes you can't see beyond your desk because you're so busy doing your day-to-day. They have a global perspective. They're looking at what trends are hitting. And so I love talking to those kind of guys. I talk to a lot of founders. I love talking to founders, love hearing their story. And I think if there's something that I learned a lot over the last 6.5 years is that we tend to think of success as linear, just like, okay, I had a single, but it is anything but. It just seems like a lot of guys have failure after failure after failure. And then all of a sudden, when you're talking to founders, sometimes there'll be 5 failures and you go, yeah, but at some point you became wildly successful and they almost don't notice.
Right.
Yeah, it's like you're swimming underwater, right? I've heard this story before. You're swimming underwater. You're trying to hold your breath. You're trying to do all these things, and all of a sudden, something hits and you're above water.
Yeah.
You shoot out of the water.
Yeah.
And it's a different world, almost, right?
Yeah. I still say this occasionally about building my own business, is that building a business is like building a boat while you're drowning. So he says, how do you do that? I have no idea. Just keep building.
I know. I know. The only way, and whether you have a job or you're starting your own business, whatever, just do something. Mm-hmm. Get up and do something every day, right? Yeah. And if you just do that all the time, just the law of averages, you're going to do something right at some point that will pay off at a later point, and you don't know when or where or how, but it will.
Yep.
Right. It is interesting. A lot of the hotter tech companies, I would say, these days that I've noticed anyways, or were hot at the conference, are folks that have tried before or have done it before, learned lessons, and are now, getting that traction with their third or their fourth or their fifth venture. Kind of to your point, Joe. Very interesting.
Yep. And I was just at the CSCMP conference, and I was there with the guys from Freight Path, and we were talking to young people and older people also, but especially about training and development there. So I was moderating a panel discussion with those guys, and they are recruiters who also do a lot of training and learning and development. And one of the things that came up was mentorship. Some of our people in the audience were bringing up mentorship. And I said, the challenge is, like you always see in the business magazine, get yourself a mentor who's done what they've already done. And I was like, yeah, that's not easy. Like maybe it's easy for you, Casey. Can you ask your dad? He's already doing that job. But it's not like the John Larkins of the world are looking and saying, yeah, anybody who calls me, I'm going to start mentoring them. He most likely wants to pick a winner and say, yeah, I want to be part of this success. And I think I see something in this guy. And so I always think that it's the blind leading the blind. And I think you hopefully build a little bit of a tribe that can help you get there.
It is, because oftentimes mentors can't give you any concrete, detailed advice, right? It's kind of just encouraging to keep going.
Yep.
In a lot of ways, that's 95% of it, right? Because no one really knows the answer, because hopefully you're doing something that no one's done before. And that means that there are no right answers. There's no wrong answers. There's just try again.
Yep.
Till you figure it out, and hopefully you're obsessed with it enough to hang with it.
Yep.
That is. So logistics of logistics. So you started podcasting, what, 2017? Was it 2017 or 2018?
Whatever.
I can't remember.
6.5 years ago, whatever that was.
6.5 years. But the logistics of logistics was something before the podcasting. Right?
Yeah.
When
So
did you
I
start
was
that?
probably 2010.
Okay.
I started blogging. And so I was a blogger for a long time. I wrote a lot of articles, and I was at a logistics company. I was the general manager, COO. It was a smaller company, but I'm real proud of what we did. And we did mostly less than truckload. And I started blogging as a way to get business. And then I started doing some webinars to get business. I did a webinar while I was still there on how to select a 3PL. Very self-serving when you're the general manager of a 3PL. And it was great. I I wrote more articles. I did more webinars on anything I was writing about. I would do a webinar on. And then a friend of mine, George, I never can remember his last name, and he's not on LinkedIn anymore. He was a blogger, and he blogged about logistics. And I remember he called me one day and said, "Hey, Joe, I want you to come on my podcast." And I was like, I don't even know what that is. So he goes, "No, it's great. You'll come on it." And I went on it. I could see the beginnings of something great, but I was like, that was kind of a rambling, stupid conversation we had. But I could see this is a pretty cool medium. And I remember when we were done, he goes, "It's a lot easier than writing, isn't it?" I was like, yes. So I started the podcast shortly after that. And then he had a lot of success in, I don't think he's videotapes and does media for high school football games out in Pennsylvania. And so he left LinkedIn. I don't know who to thank for getting me on his podcast.
I have a question for you, right? Is this a philosophical question, maybe, right? Especially in today's age, what's really the difference? What differentiates a podcast from a webinar? Are those still two separate buckets, or is that Venn diagram kind of come closer and closer?
Yeah, well, I think YouTube is definitely kind of YouTube, and we had this conversation earlier today, Kev. YouTube and podcasting are kind of colliding, so it's no longer separate, very different audiences. But I guess theoretically I could record a webinar and then push it out through all the podcasting platforms, but I think it's a little different format. That would be the only thing.
Yeah, the format.
But
It's a
I
little
will
more-
say, my first webinar, which is on how to select a 3PL, I played it straight. I went and said, here's what I would expect from my 3PL. And I had a long career in automotive, so I did have a sense for what I wanted in a
Mhm.
partner. I put that on YouTube, and then one day ISM, Institute for Supply Management, called me and they said, hey, would you come down to our conference in Texas, whatever the port is down there, not Houston, the other one, Galveston. They said, come over to Galveston and speak at our conference about this. I was like, how do you know I know what that is? They go, because we found your YouTube. And I was like,
you're an expert.
You did a YouTube webinar on it. And I was like, yeah, I remember. I said, I've written some articles on it. So they asked me to come and speak on that. And I was kind of like, wow, this is the power of this stuff. You create content and you get invited to conference. They paid for me to come. And it was awesome. And I was like, well, I'm not going to quit now.
And I'll ask Casey the same question because, I mean, all three of us have a lot of experience with webinars and podcasting.
Mhm.
Casey sold produced many webinars at FreightWaves over the years.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting. I watch, there's live podcasts now. There's one that's a comedy podcast out of Austin called Kill Tony. Where
I love Kill Tony.
Tony Hinchcliffe has, him and Brian Redband, they have on a guest, a comedy person, everybody from Joe Rogan to, they had Tucker Carlson on one time. But they bring on comedians from the audience and they do a live podcast. I think you can listen to it as a podcast afterwards, but it's an engaging live stream type of environment, and that's if there is, I think there is some value to doing it live because things are just more organic that way. Just a different medium or format, but the interactivity of a live stream like this where people could comment is just an added element, which is interesting and cool. Another way for people to engage, another way for us to make sure that we're talking about stuff that people are interested about.
I follow Kill Tony on Instagram, and I never watched the entire long form, but I've seen the funnier clips of it just because.
If you watch a full episode, start with one of the Dr. Phil episodes. There's a comedian, I forget who it is, but he does a phenomenal impersonation of Dr. Phil.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Totally worth the full episode if you have any time. But I don't know. I do have something if you guys are ready to pivot off of this topic.
Bring it on.
Something that I've noticed is there's some sweet coaching trees in logistics. Companies that great talent comes out of, I think of the Bill Parcells coaching tree in football. Who are the coaching trees? Like if you had to rank the top coaching trees, I don't know, 1 through 3 or 1 through 5 that are most impressive, and the most recent one. I think I've seen a lot of folks coming out of Uber recently doing some impressive stuff. But I'd love your take on that. You go back a long ways in the industry, so you would love that perspective.
Yep. I'll start, Kev. I just talked to a guy. We're going to do an episode on this, and it's the 25th anniversary of Backhaulers getting sold. And from Backhaulers, Backhaulers was, I believe, out of Chicago, and I'm not an expert in it. And they sold for $160 million 25 years ago to C.H. Robinson. And I think Coyote came from there, Command came from there, and I know there's a number of other companies. And by the way, there's a ton of people who came out of Coyote, and I don't know if you want to consider that part of the Backhaulers tree, but I'm not doing justice to that company. But I talked to this guy Al. He's going to be on my podcast coming up here shortly. He was a young man at Backhaulers. Now he's not quite so young, but smart guy, and he's going to come on and talk about it. And spoke to him just over the last weekend, and he said, Joe, it was just a great culture. We're doing great things. He goes, but if I had to say one thing that was better about that than anything else, it was culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard the same thing from Coyote. And Coyote has, again, and perhaps with, you say, Molo and Forager, and so many successful people came out of Coyote also. And by the way, I suspect a ton of successful people are going to come out of Molo, including, as you mentioned, Andrew Silver.
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of goes all the way back to Backhaulers as well, right? I mean, it's all under that tree. I think Nolan Transportation, and I think Coyote is going to be accelerated again since they were purchased by RXO, right? And it's just natural that once you get acquired, some talent leaves and they start their own brokerages. C.H. Robinson is another one that has a great coaching tree. You find a lot of people who have had success at C.H. Robinson. They're now in the mid-market growth type of places where they are hired to come in and grow the companies, right? So see a lot of C.H. Robinson alumni around in different spots. So that's really a great industry and coaching tree that no one thinks about.
Kev, who is that guy down in Chattanooga who sold his company? I want to say U.S. Express or something like that.
No, it was Access America.
Access America. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sold it to Coyote.
Yeah.
Ted Ailing. Is it Ted?
Yeah, it's Ted.
Yeah.
I've never interviewed him. He's hard to get on the pod, but he Craig Fuller, your old boss over at FreightWaves, he told me, I did a podcast with him many years ago called Chattanooga's the Silicon Valley of trucking, and he said we all should thank Ted Ailing, but he went even further back, saying Chattanooga was always a freight hub because of its location close to Dalton, Georgia, where all the carpets are made. Carpet is good freight.
Yeah. And North Georgia is full of carpet manufacturing. Mohawk and Shaw, yeah, the big one, Shaw and Mohawk. I think when I was a broker, I went down there. I met with both of those companies, and I think between those two alone, they're responsible for about half of every floor in the country, right? That they sell the flooring, whether it's carpet or hardwood or whatever it is. Half of all the floors you see across this country come out of those two companies.
Believe it.
And then I think it's pretty nicely located on the interstate system, north-south and east-west. There's a massive interchange there. I think FreightWaves at one point calculated like 80% of over-the-road truckload freight moves through Chattanooga at some point in its journey. But yeah, Kevin and I actually drove to a conference in Chicago several years back through a driving snowstorm, and the headline debate at that conference was, is the real Freight Alley Chicago, or is it?
I was supposed to moderate that debate, and I couldn't get there.
Yes,
it was between Craig Fuller and
Matt Silver.
Matt Silver, and then at the last, planes were going off the runway in Chicago, and I was like, I'm in Detroit. I was like, I'm not driving there. and then they called like the day before and said, hey, we're moving you up to 10 a.m. I go, don't fly in till 10 a.m. So we handed it off. And so I didn't moderate that because I had interviewed both Matthew Silver, and he was at Forager at that 1 minute, founder, and of course Craig Fuller from representing Chattanooga. So two great markets.
There are two great markets, and that's there's some of the coaching trees come out of both Chicago and Chattanooga, Atlanta. I think NTG, right, Nolan Transportation Group, is going to see a wave.
First time I met Kevin was on that exhibit floor in Chicago.
Yeah.
The other Kevin.
Of the Nolan variety.
Of the Nolan variety, yes. The successful one. The successful Kevin.
You know that.
But yeah, I think there are. You can see it, especially. We're going to get another wave. I think of great brokerages that pull up, and they're going to address a lot of different challenges that the former group have tackled. Right, a lot of that's going to be technology. A lot of that's going to be security, right? And coming from where backhaulers were calling carriers, the split model comes from backhaulers, right? Where you have carrier cells, right? That's a wave that is now status quo or normal within the industry. We'll see what trends.
Yeah,
harnessing
means.
Technology maybe being the next one. Sorry,
so Joe, it's interesting that things there's not as many cradle to grave joints anymore, Kevin. That's certainly something that I heard a number of different brokerages talk about today, is shifting to, the split model, having a carrier sales and a separate customer sales team.
Yeah, I always think that if the three of us were silly enough to start a freight brokerage today, we would say, I don't want to do cradle to grave, because we're going to end up with one or two guys working for us who are going to own 80% of our freight, and they're going to have the relationship. They're going to do everything for them. And what I'd rather say is, that we have some sales guys, but the sales guys, they're right next to the account management guys and the customer success guys, the billing guys, and everybody has a relationship with them.
That is.
Yeah,
you kind of have that split between the split or the Chicago model and cradle to grave. Now you have the pod, which I think came from Access America. Actually, that pod style and it's something that Axle, right? So there's another coaching tree type of thing. Axle has the pod style, and where it's kind of a hybrid between the two, right? You have the cradle to the grave, then you start bringing on different people and they start booking carriers for you, and then all of a sudden you have your own pod that you're overseeing.
Exactly.
Right. Started my first gig, my first piece of freight tech I ever touched was the TMS at Transplace, working on the Kellogg's pod. Just letting trucks bid for the freight, and getting it there. So it is interesting. And then it's interesting. I see some tech companies coming out of Uber, which is interesting. ISO is doing carrier scorecarding, and this guy Paul Singer,
FleetWorks.
Seems like there's a lot of interesting folks coming out of Uber, and then FreightWaves as well. You see a whole bunch of people all over the place.
I'm looking at two of them.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's talk. Let's gear it back over to we want to talk about cybersecurity today. So let's just I guess kind of jump into cybersecurity and kind of what that means, because we talk a lot about outside fraud, trailers being stolen and double brokering and things like that. But as we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, certainly since December of 2019, is people getting hacked.
Yeah, Kev, we talked about this earlier today. I was out for a walk. I don't know what you were doing, but it was, I think you might've been out for a walk too. Maybe. And I've been saying on my podcast, and I was at some conferences and I said the same thing, and I don't think it's a revelation here, that we are going to have what might be the cyber 9/11 or a digital 9/11, where somebody gets hacked, and it might not even be in our industry. It might be somewhere outside our industry where we're part of our economy is taken down. And the next day, that 9/12, whatever it is, they're going to say, everyone who's a big shipper is going to say, I demand blank. And I think it's going to be SOC 2 compliant. I'm not an expert in all of what needs to be done. There are experts out there, but I think all of us who, regardless what business you're in, need to start saying, what am I going to do to secure myself the best I can? And again, when you look and say AT&T got hacked over the summer, it wasn't a hack, but Microsoft and the airlines went down because of the CrowdStrike. It was more of a vulnerability. And I won't mention names, but there's a number of large carriers who've been hacked. And some of it's ransomware, where they say, we know what you made last year. We want 20% of that. That's what they ask for. I guess that's a standard number. And that's crazy. So we're going to have to do something to prepare for that.
Yeah, it's something that is facing every industry of companies of every size, right? Is this cat and mouse game now of cyber criminals coming in, but something on a large scale it can be just right around the corner at any time.
Yeah. And Kev, you think about, well, you mentioned freight brokers for a second. So there's 25,000 freight brokers. I know that because I follow Brush Pass Research. There used to be 30,000. And a number of them, of the 25,000, how many are on the small side? 20,000, 21,000?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very small size.
So
yeah,
a lot of them have major shippers that they work with. And then they also so they might work with dozens of large shippers, and they work with thousands of small carriers. And as that broker, you are either the conduit for all that malware, or you are the barrier. And it's something we need to address sooner rather than later. And I was at the Trimble conference, and I asked one of the executives there, how does this industry upgrade when it's low margin and there are so many small carriers and so many small brokers? And that is the dilemma. How?
Well, and I think some of that has to do with there's this you're describing a long tail of carriers, right? And brokerages, but there's this huge long tail of shippers, right? You have the Fortune 1000, or those companies that ship out of the Fortune 1000, they carry pretty. I think Seth and I did a research report on this at one point. About 25% of all the freight is controlled by the top 1,000 shippers.
Yep.
But the other 75%, there's a lot of SMBs and people below the SMB that have to be serviced. And, there's only so many that you can, because I don't even know a number, millions, right? There's only so much reach for any one brokerage or any group of brokerages or a group of carriers, right? And they all have their own special needs and service requirements, and some of it's consistent freight, some of it's not consistent whatsoever, but it's very high value. I made a lot of money over the years, people who shipped very rarely, right, or inconsistently, but it was high value projects. So it needed to be at a certain place at a certain time, and if it wasn't, it cost a lot of money. So they didn't really care. They just paid whatever, just as long as you got it there. So, and flip side, it's bottled water that moves from DC to DC or DC to store, and
right. There's a ton of freight, and I guess my point is that on that digital 9/11, whether it hits in our space or someone else's space, we already know. Kev, you and I talked about it. We don't need to mention names, but we know multiple large carriers, top names, and some have been very public about it, some have not. If a carrier can get hacked, then it can happen to another carrier, and it can happen to the brokers. And not all of them have to announce it publicly. Some of them, if you're publicly traded, I think there's an SEC requirement that says you must
Yes, there is.
report, but we have to do something before it happens. By the way, I'm going to the NMFTA cybersecurity conference down in Cleveland in a few weeks. And NMFTA is the standard setting body for LTL. And they're having a whole conference on cybersecurity. They think it's that important because there have been there's only 25 LTL companies that do 90% of the volume, 90 some percent of the volume.
Yeah.
We can't afford to have one of those guys offline. And we've had multiple of those offline. And I was at CSCMP a few weeks ago and I talked to, I think it was Old Dominion, but it doesn't matter. One of the top LTL companies. And I said, I asked about cybersecurity. I think they said they had like 900,000 companies or hits on their website overnight. And they say, so we're very much aware that there's companies trying to hack us. And that was, I also went to the Trimble conference. Right at the beginning, one of the keynote speeches said, our industry is under attack. And Trimble is, the technology tech stack for drivers. They're one way you get there, right? So you say, we're working with a major company. Trimble's a $15 billion company. If you're working with them, you're probably most likely safe. You're most likely compliant. But I think all of the transportation management systems that are out there, all of these, what I call the killer apps that are out there that we all plug into, the visibility tools, the pricing tools, we need to make sure each one of those is bulletproof. And I think a lot of the newer technology, it's kind of built in, but we need to double check.
We do. We got to audit. And it's interesting. Another thing that people were talking about was like a lot of the tech that was added into these brokerage stacks in a hot market was done so pretty quickly. And now people are just starting to go back and, audit their tech stack. Are we using this like we intended to use it when we bought it? A lot of times they're not, right? And they've got to rip it out. And we've got a little bit of a Frankenstein model in the space. So it is definitely something.
Right on, Casey. I know you're dead on. And I heard somebody say on my podcast, it was one of the NMFTA guys that we did a podcast to promote the upcoming conference. And he said, we built all these APIs. And the reason is so we can connect fast. He goes, but consider, is connecting fast worth it if it's a potential, loading malware. So you have to make sure you're safe computing here, safe connections. And I spoke to a friend of mine, Kev, when you asked me if we come on and talk about this. I talked to Susan Cargill. I met her at CSCMP. She would not call herself a cybersecurity expert. She'd say preparedness. And she mentioned you have to first try and prevent this stuff. So do the very best you can to prevent it. Then next, you need to detect it, right? And you need to detect it quickly, because sometimes there's all sorts of different attacks, but they'll be in your systems for a while waiting for some event to come out. And then she said, then you have to prepare for what's going to happen when you're hacked. And she said, you have to be able to resist, and you have to be able to absorb that hit and keep your operations open. And she said, last but not least, you need to recover. She said, all of this stuff requires pre-planning. And she said, same thing you and I were talking about today, Kev. It starts with a question to your tech partners, question to your carrier partners. What are we going to do? Make sure that, and I suspect a lot of times if you talk to a company like Fairlanes, they might say, we're there already. You're good. You're good to go. But appreciate the concern.
Right. And that's a way folks could get in for sure. It's interesting. There's this guy, Bryce Austin, who spoke at the conference as well. Sorry to continue to talk about this freaking conference you guys didn't attend, but he was the head of cybersecurity at Target when Target had the massive data breach. The way that those hackers got into the system was literally, I think, through one of the point of sale registers, right? That let somebody into the system and they're able to jump into the production environment and into the development environment and tweak that. There were some bells and whistles going off. They didn't know why or what was going on, and next thing they know, this bug has been playing with their code and pushed back to all of their cash registers across the world.
Oh.
And he's out of a job, and Target's getting beat up in the headlines, and a lot of people, like their identity, right?
Their reputation,
all their customers, right? Their banking information was out on the dark web. So yeah, to his point was, you really have to be intentional about, those things that you just mentioned, but it's got to be part of the culture too. And I think that's kind of one of the themes that, we touched on, but didn't really drive into, and talking about the big, great brokerages is, I think that's a huge differentiator, right? Is
you want to sell this. And I think it's stuff like the onboarding. You make sure that we're not onboarding anybody who's got something wrong. But somebody mentioned offboarding to me recently. They say we do a great job of onboarding carrier partners and onboarding new customers, new employees. But when we're not working with them, how do I make sure I off them? And also, our whole industry still relies on emails with attachments. How many times have you received an attachment where you're like, I know that's fake, I'm not clicking it, but you're still tempted? Because, by the way, as a small business owner, it says, the day I do invoicing, it'll pop up payment from so-and-so. And I'm like, I know that's not the payment, but man, wouldn't it be great if it was?
I know. I was about to say, I'm getting emails all the time. I mean, like weekly, about, some random person in logistics, a brokerage, right? Sending me an invoice or POD or something to click on. And I know that someone's email got hacked. And it's just like on the individual level, at least, right? Someone's email just got hacked because I'm getting an attachment with an invoice that is not mine, or some kind of request with an attachment, of course, on it. So you have those old school, you have the new school, really savvy criminals out there, but you still have the old school phishing attacks.
Yeah, that's how they're getting us.
Yeah.
Phishing works, and so does he sending document images, and our whole industry still relies on these document images. And we have to do I think it begins with asking the questions of all of our technology partners, like if you're using Outlook, say, hey, are we using the right level? If we didn't pay for something, and by the way, a lot of people use Gmail. I think it's probably solid, but are you using the consumer version or using the paid version, right?
Well, that's a really big, I don't want to say red flag, but it is kind of a red flag. But it is something that I saw all the time in Careless, right? Because I wanted to get the corporate email, not the FMCSA email and file.
Not the Gmail address.
Yeah, straight to dispatch, right? And I remember telling my guys and gals, we have just too many Gmail at gmail.com. There's too many of these. There's no way that all these trucking companies running 50, 60, 70 trucks are using free Gmail accounts, right? They are.
Yeah, they are.
Yep.
They are.
And by the way, maybe Google is up to speed. Maybe if you look into that, you go, okay, this is legitimate and it's okay. I don't know. And I think this is one of those things where it's almost a hygiene thing where you have to say,
yeah, it's just too easy. We're
going to begin before it happens, because the day after it happens, it's a mess, and it's the preparedness. The preparedness is going to save you a lot of money over the actual event.
It is. And for any small carrier or brokerage that is listening to this, right? If you're using dispatch at Kevin's brokerage or dispatch1 Kevin's brokerage at gmail.com. You know how easy it is for any scammer to do dispatch to Kevin's brokerage at gmail.com.
Yep.
And it's very hard for anyone to catch that.
Mm-hmm.
At least if you have your own domain, right, at kevinsbrokerage.com, then someone can't just tweak it just a little bit on that side. At least they'd have to go in and buy a domain to tweak it. That's a little bit of a hurdle.
I also think that, you can pick up the phone occasionally and say, let me make a phone call and see if that actually is Casey's sent me an email, because it seems different. And I always think you don't get, and where this moves into fraud a little bit, but nobody gets defrauded by the carrier they've been working with for 10 years. Nobody gets defrauded by the guy they talk to on the phone once a month.
Right. True. It's you mentioned something earlier, and I want to ask this question. Is this growing cybersecurity risk what it, maybe a 9/11 of cybersecurity for the industry, if you will? Is that what it's going to take to get people to stop with the data silos and stop with the hoarding and find a way to jump to the 21st century and really, allow the real data to kind of show you what's not?
Well, you probably know better than I, Casey, but I will say that I think human nature always says that, look, you begin the healthy living the day after the heart attack, not the day before. And but I will also say, I think a lot of the technologies out there are actually already doing the right thing. The technology companies, especially the newer ones. I think I just spoke yesterday to Revenova, great company. They are based in the Salesforce platform. They're in the Salesforce ecosystem. Salesforce spends billions of dollars a year making sure that they are rock solid. It's not to say they can never be hacked, but there's a lot less likely than maybe a small company that says, hey, we're bootstrapping it, and it's hard for us to make the big investments in all of this. Even those companies, I suspect, are following best practices. It's just, it's not.
I heard about one this week, Joe, that was blowing my mind. I mean, $100 million brokerage that, does not have a carrier vetting process really at all, right? They might hire pretty much anybody off the road. And my old buddy Reed at Highway is just shaking his head and kicking himself. He's like, "What the hell are these guys doing?" So it's really interesting. Some people they're betting.
I think the proper onboarding, from what I understand, and I'm no expert in this, but I think proper onboarding solves a lot of this problem. But I had a friend, he was a very large shipper. I'd done some work for them, helping them select their transportation partner, and they spend upwards of $80-100 million a year on transportation. And he said to me years ago, said, Joe, how much longer are we going to tolerate emails in our process? And I was like, good question. And what he was getting at is, Casey, I might give you I'm saying it's going to be $1,800. You write back yes, and then I put it in the system that it's going to be $1,800. And then later on, the price goes up to $2,200, and I send you a note. Hey, Casey, sorry, lost that truck. Can you do $2,200? You come back, yes. And what's the system of record? Well, it's the TMS, but we have all these outside emails. And I know it's possible to say the only way those emails are all done internal to our system. Well, I don't know I don't even know that necessarily solves our problem, but I think it gets to what my friend and customer was getting at, which is, right, if we're gonna have a system of record, I don't want a whole bunch of emails outside of it. We love emails because it lets us do unstructured communication, just like I described.
And now, people are booking trucks through text message, through Discord, through Google Chat. And it's gotten worse, actually. But it's
surprise.
There are technologies like a Drum Kit, who won today in the Shark Tank at Technovations on the stage against a bunch of other cool brands. what they're doing is allowing you to take the data that lives in your GChat, in your inbox, and automatically populate that into your TMS, into the WMS for scheduling, whatever it may be. There may be a world where, because there's so much information and knowledge and data that's slipping through the cracks in those communications, and it's probably more today, not less, than it was when your shipper buddy was screaming at the clouds about it.
Yeah. Well, again, I think I'm not an expert by any reach, but I am going to interview an expert next week. And she said, Joe, can I really call myself an expert at this? In that she worked for a company that was hacked. And so she's kind of gone through it. And she says, I've been very curious. But she says, this is such a rapidly changing problem.
The attack vectors continue to change, right?
And by the way, I interviewed Felipe Capella from LoadSmart. He says, we have a red team and a blue team. They're constantly fighting. And he says, one's trying to invade, the other one's trying to protect. I also heard, I think it's a tech company that says to a whole bunch of ethical hackers, we will pay you to find bugs, find a way into our system. I think that's the kind of thing that I want to work with partners like that. And that I'm not against mom and pop companies, but I think the mom and pop companies have to be part of a platform that keeps them that safe. And Felipe said something, he goes, we're SOC 2 compliant, but I don't know that all brokers need to be. And I said, well, I do. I mean, I don't want to say to the boss the day after we're hacked, yeah, I didn't think SOC 2 compliance was that important for our carrier. They're like, yeah, we're a $1 billion company. Thanks for the effort, Joe. Your stuff, we'll ship your box of your stuff to your house. So I do think we all just need to start asking the questions and start becoming aware of this, because again, it's a lot easier to be prepared than it is to fix it after the fact.
Insurance rates aren't getting any cheaper, not any less nuclear verdicts. Capital's not getting any cheaper. Yeah,
damage control over hacks is messy. It's always been messy. My time at being managing editor at FreightWaves, we ran into a lot of instances where companies were in damage control, emergency situations, trying to figure out what's going on, trying not to let the hack leak out into the public and to be written about by FreightWaves. But a lot of times the cat was already out of the bag by the time we knew about it, right? Because when your entire system goes down and your customers can't log in, your carriers can't log in, you can't log in, people are going to notice.
Yep.
And the bigger you are, the more notice it's going to be. And so damage control is not good.
And it's an unfortunate thing, but we see it. The war in Afghanistan. I'm sorry, not Afghanistan, in Ukraine and Russia. And what are they always attacking in Russia? Supply lines, logistics. Yeah. And so if God forbid the world gets any crazier and somebody says, hey, how do we slow down the United States or Canada or anyone else listening on this? It's, hey, you stop their logistics. And you don't have to bomb it. You just have to slow it down. You just have to say, hey, the thing is full of bugs. It's got a whole bunch of malware in it. So it's time to clean up our acts.
It is. It definitely is. Well, Joe, thanks for dropping by, talking to us on.
Thank you so much.
What's the bid? Yeah, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Kevin, it was a pleasure talking to you. And Casey, great talking to you again.
Likewise, Joe. It was a pleasure, man.
All right. You guys talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
You bet.
See ya.